Welcome to the Horizon Engage podcast, where we bring you the expert opinion on geopolitical risk. Horizon Engage enables investors to make business decisions with confidence by providing intelligence on global developments and regional and country risks. My name is Sasha Zaslavsky. I'm the president and co-founder of Horizon Engage, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this episode where we discuss the art and science of predictions. And I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Mike Knights and Alex Almeida. Mike has been with Horizon Engage since 2012. He's the chief product officer overseeing all of our research, and Alex is our security director. And before I hand it over to them, I just wanted to make one simple observation about the ways in which predictions are often referred to as dark arts. And that darkness undoubtedly relates to the mystery and mysticism that accompanies predictions from the ancient times. And of course, the fact that these predictions often concern the fall of empires and the death and destruction that accompanies them. From Cassandra predicting the fall of Troy, to Nostradamus predicting the fall of Napoleon, to Rasputin foretelling the end of the Romanov dynasty. We have this of mysticism and darkness around the prediction, and two of my colleagues are carrying this mantle now because there's no shortage of terrible events and calamities that are visited upon the world. We started thinking about the podcast and this episode when we correctly foretold the timing of the US attack on Iran most recently. Investors don't need just the predictions of calamities. We're talking about not just risks, but opportunities that accompany these events. And these days, there are plenty of them, especially, of course, this year. But I wanted to start by asking Mike about this correct prediction of the timing of the US attack. We came up with it in early January this year, getting this right to the day from quite a number of days before. Mike, tell us a little bit about how it worked. Talk us through the mechanics of this art of prediction when you look at a major geopolitical event that impacts investors globally.
Well, thanks very much for queuing me up there, Sasha. Ultimately, we are paid to predict, and we need to be strong predictors. Sometimes we're right, in our case, well more than half the time, and sometimes we're wrong, and you have to allow yourself the freedom to be wrong sometimes. Otherwise, you will never do a strong prediction and you will never ultimately be right. But, any client can say, we're not sure what the future is going to be. It's very murky. We're paid to actually make a call and to put some numbers on it, percentages usually, level of confidence. And that allows the clients to actually plan based on an expert view, rather than to be left in limbo, unable to make one decision or another. So prediction is a very necessary function in business intelligence. And I think, we owe it to the clients to be a strong predictor, even if we're wrong sometimes. They stick with us because we're right more than we're wrong. And the old saying goes that a good intelligence officer is right 51% of the time. Well, we're right much more than 51% of the time. But nonetheless, if you're right more than you're wrong, you're still going to be reducing risk to your clients and helping them to make more money. I'll say that, when we went into this year, the initial tip-off for us that we were going to see an Israeli or US military action in the Gulf against Iran came when we saw Benjamin Netanyahu's Mar-a-Lago visit to meet with President Trump right at the end of 2025. So we can move on to the next slide. Away from these strong predictions, I'll show you a little bit about what we were looking at. These things have to start with human intelligence. Ultimately, long before you start to move capabilities in place to undertake a military operation, you have to signal intent. So what we've done here is to detect intent. And we got that because of some very specialized reporting from within the Trump administration that allowed us to say this is almost certainly a go in the first quarter of this year. Alex is going to talk a little bit about how we then tracked capability going forward from that point. Because capability then takes you from strategic warning of a number of weeks or months down to sort of tactical warning. When exactly is this going to happen? And how are we going to know days or hours beforehand when it is happening, which is very important for clients. I'll say a couple of key kind of rules that we've built into predictions over the years. First, strategic and tactical are intimately linked. Most people look down their nose a little bit at tactical. They say, at the tactical level, you're just focused on the details, this drone system, that specific date that thing happened. But in reality, strategic and tactical are very tightly linked. The type of drone being used against the target may tell us a lot about what kind of support is behind that attack, what the intent was behind the attack. Was it to warn? Was it to damage? What does it say going forward about the level of threat or what's about to happen? Likewise, the people going into a meeting, who was sent? Were they the best? Were they decisive? Were they empowered? Or does this look like one of the parties is just playing for time? These are tactical details, but they tell us a lot about strategic intent. I think additionally, capability and intention are quite tightly linked. We knew that there was an intent to do something about the Iranian nuclear program from the very start of the year. But how broad or how narrow was it going to be? That's where Alex's monitoring of the capabilities that had been deployed became very important. But capability also plays right back into intent. If you have the forces necessary in theatre to mount a very large scale air campaign against every element of Iran's national power, that makes the option to do so more thinkable. You can't, you simply don't have the option, until you've made that deployment. So it doesn't matter how much intention you've got. If you haven't got the capability, it's not going to happen.
Mm.
Once you've got the capability in place, it can start to shape intent. So the final thing I'm going to say about our attitude towards prediction, and this is something we've learned over the years, is that trajectory is much easier to predict than velocity. So, think of it like a bullet. Your trajectory is the direction of the bullet's travel. The velocity is the speed. How soon is it going to get there? How soon is it going to take effect? Um, in predictions, you very often get the trajectory right, but most people get the velocity wrong. And in this case of the Iran war, we got the velocity exactly right, down to a 12-hour period from, well over a week beforehand. And that's because of very careful monitoring of the capabilities that Alex is going to talk about in a second. But you
Right.
can see from the right-hand example that when a lot of people were saying, the velocity's here, it's here right now, we're about to have start the operations, we could just tell, because not enough of these indicators were ticked red for danger, that we were still at an early stage of the deployment and people were jumping at shadows at that point. But we put in place a system to monitor, when they were not jumping at shadows. And that's what Alex will talk about next.
Right. Well, let me ask Alex. Mike has mentioned the importance of measuring military capability as part of our dark art of prediction, and if you've used this tool, in the last few years, just thinking about the big crisis that you worked on, the breakout of Islamic State, the outbreak of the war in Ukraine with Russia's invasion, and now you predicted the exact day the operations would start in Iran 3 weeks ahead of time. How did you do that? What's your method?
Yeah, right. So basically, what we built, and we were quite deliberate about how we went about this, is what I call our indicators and warnings board, um, which is this set of indicators, not exclusively military. We track some non-military, diplomatic, political, economic ones as well. But in this case, it was primarily military indicators. And what it did was track the movement of some very specific military asset types and capabilities. In this case, in the lead up to the US and Israeli strikes on Iran. And those were built quite carefully based on the kinds of movements that we had seen. For example, in the lead up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Slightly different set of indicators there, obviously focused on the Russian military and their capabilities, but a similar, not too dissimilar scenario, at least, um, on the sorts of movements we saw in the lead up to the US operation in Venezuela at the start of this year. Again, a very similar situation with these regional and, in some cases, global movements of US military forces, and also in the lead up to the US strikes in Yemen last year and to the 12-day war last summer. So basically, we drilled down on a few key military capabilities, combat search and rescue, for example, the movement of stealth strike aircraft. And we weighted those specific indicators based on their significance and their assessed predictive power based on how predictive they had been in the lead up to these other military crises. And then throughout the build up to the US strikes on Iran, we tracked those continuously and in detail over a period of around 4 weeks to 2 months almost, right from when we started. At the start, the board was almost entirely green, and then as the U.S. started to flow more of these military assets in, we slowly started to tripping those to orange, red as they started showing up. And a couple days before the strikes, about 48, 72 hours, at that point, the board was almost entirely red. And we knew that there was a very high probability that a strike was imminent within that 12 to 24-hour, 48-hour window.
Let me ask you about how you work with our country experts. We've got 100 of them at Horizon Engage. And when we were preparing for this podcast, we were thinking about what can go wrong with predictions. And one thing that very often goes wrong is expert bias. The bias that when you follow a country develops impacts your ability to calculate the leader's um, risk rationality calculations, figure out the unusual patterns. How do you overcome that in your work? Because you've covered so many of these crises around the world, and you've communicated, of course, with our colleagues who cover these countries. How does it work in practice?
Mhm. No, that's that's definitely a very good point, particularly if you're focused on one particular jurisdiction, one particular environment, even one particular scenario in some cases for a very long time, and you've been working on that for years, you do end up becoming very habituated to these sort of predictable patterns, the things you consider likely. And in the longer term, that does tend to sort of end up narrowing the bounds of what you consider likely and what you consider probable. That's definitely something I've experienced in my own work looking at Iraq,
Yeah.
Kurdistan over a period of several years.
Absolutely, and our work on Russia, I remember. Sorry to interrupt. You were much better at predicting the timing and manner of the invasion of Ukraine than I was, and I have to admit that it was very difficult for me to wrap my head around this fundamental shift in what we saw as Putin's rationality and the cost benefit calculation. And you had this kind of surgical precision and very cold and detached um, calculation pointing to the timing and manner, and that was
Mhm.
awesome at the time.
Yeah, I think what this does, this particular format that we have, where you're tracking a very specific set of hard military capabilities. So they're either there or they're not. To some extent, each of these indicators is a binary.
Mm.
um, what this does is it forces you to step back, step out of this expert bubble that you can get into if you've been
That's right.
working on these particular environments for a very long time. It forces you to step back, take a hard look with a very cold sort of eye at what you're seeing develop. And I think over these past couple years, certainly going back to Ukraine, but also Venezuela, the strikes on Iran last summer. My mantra has sort of become, it's worth trusting the military indicators in some of these scenarios, because over these last 2, 3, 4 case studies that we've seen, their predictive power has been very high indeed.
Great. Thank you. Mike, tell us a little bit more about the more systematic aspect of our predictive work, right? We're not just jumping from one crisis to another. We are building products that consistently address investor needs for forecasting, right? And in particular, we developed Advance last year, which is our country benchmarking and forecasting tool. Uh, could you just tell our listeners a little bit about how this tool works?
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, I think at the start, predictive analysis is not just about predicting threats and risks. It's also about predicting opportunities. And, not to be too stereotypical about this, but e- every risk in some ways is an opportunity in disguise for companies that are well prepared for a certain type of risk. They respond faster, they get out of environments faster. And so, whether it's risk analysis and making people better prepared and less shocked by what happens, or whether it's pure commercial opportunity analysis, predictive analysis can be very, very valuable to companies. It's obviously very valuable to people who are watching how markets are moving, but also to direct investors. So, in the advanced product that we have developed, what we're doing essentially is to score the opportunity and durability for foreign direct investors within key countries, particularly resource-rich environments, for oil and gas, for mining, for renewables and other sectors. But what we do, as well as scoring the present day value for this investment environment across 12 key indicators that you see here on the right-hand image, um, we're also creating predictive scores for the 1 year, 3 year, and 5+ year timelines. And so if you look on the left-hand side, you can see here, this is the 1 to 3 year oil and gas scores. Maximum you could get is 10 durability, 10 opportunity. Minimum would be 0 and 0. But hardly anybody's ever at the close to the ends of the axis. And what we see here is the square boxes towards the center of these polygons are today's score, and the dots that connect these polygons together are the various 1 to 3 year scenarios that we have written and then scored. And what it shows you is, just to give an example, you have two countries here that their score is pretty similar right now, but they have rather different profiles in the future. And, in the case of Iraq, for many reasons that we, very carefully worked on over the years, it's got quite a narrow scenario space. The things that are wrong with Iraq won't get fixed quickly. And the things that have stayed strong about Iraq won't get broken quickly, because this country has been through the ringer and it's kind of stuck a little bit on train tracks right now. So it's predictable, oddly. Whereas something like Suriname, is at the beginning of its energy adventure. And we don't know how President Simon's government, which direction it's going to go in. Will it move towards resource nationalism? Will it move towards quite a cohesive national industrial strategy that favors investors? there's a wider scenario space for this country than there is for Iraq right now. So, if you want predictability, you might like Iraq better than Suriname in this particular case. But if you want something where you're gambling on there being more upside potential, you might want Suriname in this particular case. And if you look on the right-hand side, one of the things that we've been doing is to create these sort of tasting wheels of current and future opportunity and doability within these environments, so that you can say, a bit like with a whiskey or a wine, the flavor that I want is strong in these dimensions, but it doesn't have to be so strong in other dimensions. So you can see here, today's kind of present day taste of Iraq, or at least, today's present day taste of Iraq. And then in the 1 to 3 year time frame for oil and gas, we've just signposted the most favorable in purple and the least favorable in green. So, for those of you listening in on the podcast, come and take a look at some of these on our website, because they're really interesting. They show you a kind of concentric spider web pattern or a tasting wheel, in which the larger the volume of the area, the better the investment environment. And you can see in Iraq, for instance, it's dipping inwards towards lower attractiveness in the sphere of security right now, unsurprisingly. But within the 1 to 3 year time frame, both our best and our least good outcomes for Iraq still have security rebounding considerably. So, this is the kind of work we're doing in the predictive space that's not focused on risks or threats, but is more focused on what's the commercial opportunity within these areas. It's what we call the advance system.
I think it's fascinating. It kind of shows you the value of this forecasting exercise. And these very two examples of Iraq, a country that appears to be in a very dangerous neighborhood that is being ripped apart by internal sectarian tensions, that has militias, is actually more predictable in a way than Suriname, a tiny place in a very peaceful corner of the world. Eisenhower used to say that plans are worthless, but planning is everything. I think here we kind of see the value of this planning for the future. But I want to thank you both for sharing your insights, for hopefully showing us that planning is useful, but maybe we arrive at pretty good plans too. So Mike and Alex, big thanks for sharing your views. Please tune in again to hear more about Horizon Engage on our podcast, bringing you expert opinion on geopolitical, regional, and country risks.